friends. Welcome back to the Wall Street Skinny. I'm Jen.
I'm Kristen. And today we have a really awesome episode for you guys. So we are interviewing Sonia Gupta. She is a partner at Goldman Sachs who co-heads biotech banking at Goldman in San Francisco. And she was a former classmate of mine at Brown. And we are having her come on to go through so many different topics that we get questions from you guys about all the time. So not only are we going to touch on the specific healthcare banking angle, which is something that we get tons of requests to get more into some of the industry group nuances, but also she joined not directly out of undergrad, as so many people we tend to talk to in banking do. She actually went into consulting after undergrad, then went to business school and came in as an associate, worked through the ranks, and then climbed to partner, and now obviously co-heads, again, biopharma over in San Francisco. So we're going to get into kind of like, what is it like basically getting into banking post an MBA, the utility of the MBA. We're going to talk about what it's like working in San Francisco. And then we're going to get into some of this very specific, like niche, nuanced considerations with biopharma. And so what's interesting is we talk about in this episode, like the healthcare banking space is incredibly vast. And so when we say healthcare banking, I mean, you could be working with companies that are like literally creating little pieces that go into like hospital beds, all the way to what she does, where you're actually trying to work with companies that are developing drugs that potentially could be like the next cure for XYZ disease. And again, the way that you think about the valuation of these different types of businesses can vary so much. And specifically with biopharma, it's really cool because there are so many parallels to the tech space and also to almost like the venture capital world, because you are almost like buying lottery tickets with each of the drugs that you're trying to get through the FDA approval process. So when we think about valuing these businesses, it's not as simple as like run a simple DCF. Although yes, you are going to be running a DCF, but like the way that you have to incorporate the potential that, I mean, you basically have this drug is going to like get through the approval process or it's not, right? It's like this is going to happen or this is going to happen. So it's a really interesting conversation.
I think it's so interesting to think about valuing a company that's not profitable yet and the startup-y nature, in effect, of this specific niche within a broader investment banking vertical. But yeah, for those of you who are considering a career or even a 2-year analyst program in investment banking, many of you have wondered what's it like being in, say, a product group like M&A versus an industry group. And we talk about that a little bit with Sonia too, that not every bank is the same, where you're either in a product group or you're in an industry group. You might be a jack of all trades within one of these industry groups where you're doing everything.
Or said differently, not all banks have separate M&A groups. And so Morgan Stanley, where we went, basically, if you went into XYZ group, you unfortunately didn't get to work on the M&A deals because like this other M&A group basically took all like the juicy deals. Well, at Goldman, they don't have a separate M&A group. And so we talk about the fact that like if you're basically going into an industry group, you're also doing your own M&A. So that's something, because people do tend to want that experience. And it's also, I think, interesting in light of how JP Morgan came out and said that they were putting the kibosh on, or they were going to fire anybody who accepted an offer at a private equity firm within 18 months of joining JP Morgan, because there had been this history of basically analysts coming in and get recruiting for private equity roles, oftentimes before they even start their banking job. And JP Morgan was like, no mas. So the whole thing though is that not everyone wants to go to banking and use it as a stepping stone to private equity. And so this is also going to touch more on basically like what actually happens at the more senior levels. I don't think we talk enough about what that is like. And
100%. And like this new push from banks to increase retention. JP Morgan in that same announcement decided to shorten the total term. They had a 3-year program and they've shortened it to 2.5. So Sonia speaks to this as well. There is this newfound desire to retain talent within the banks versus it used to be almost like a mandatory up or out. It wasn't like, please stay, don't go to private equity. It was like, we don't have a spot for you. Like, no, we're recruiting a whole new class of associates from MBA programs. We don't need you. We don't need to cultivate talent internally. So there's subtle shifts happening within the industry, and there's subtleties from bank to bank that are now starting to differ in practice more materially. So I think as you're considering a career and trying to understand the nuances between the different banks, an episode like this contrasted against an episode where we interview either someone from another bank or someone, from a private equity firm, and thinking about that recruiting and what they're focusing on could be a really, really interesting insight for you to consider.
Yeah. And I will say, when I was like fresh out of college, I didn't really think about what is it like when you're at the senior levels in banking. And when we're sitting there having this conversation with Sonia, I was like, that actually sounds really cool.
I think that one of the things that's a little bit unique to rising through the ranks in one of these industry groups is that you become an expert in this field that you aren't actually a practitioner in. Coming from a markets background and more of like an investing background, I certainly didn't want to be the one, I don't know, putting together a pension plan, right? I was like, I know what these pension funds need to do. Good enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, short-dated assets, long-dated liabilities, pretty much it. Like, not out and becoming an expert in like different types of pension plans and like how they work and like what it's like to work at a pension fund. And certainly something that happens as well on the private equity investing side, that you are going to become an expert in what these portfolio companies do. You may even go run a portfolio company, but just a unique aspect to this that you might not get in, say, an M&A role, where it's like, okay, widget company A, widget company B, they do two totally different things, but we're buying or selling a business. I know how to do that day in, day out.
Which is probably why they do a lot more of their own internal M&A, because these companies are so specific that it's so like, specific. It's also, I mean, it's interesting when we were talking to her about even just like the process of going public. I mean, so many of these companies go public so much earlier, where the rest of the industry, you've seen this massive shift away from going public. Mm-hmm. Here you have companies going public before they're profitable. And so it's a very different animal. And the analysis you're doing is so much different versus like, let's look at what happens with like, the earnings per share when you do a, accretion dilution analysis. I mean, again, it's more nuanced than that. So anyway, this was such an awesome conversation and we're so excited to finally air it. So why don't we bring Sonia on? We are so excited to be joined today by Sonia Gupta, who is a partner at Goldman Sachs. She sits in San Francisco and co-heads biotech banking. And she actually was a former classmate of mine at Brown and has such an interesting story. So she started not in banking, was actually working in consulting, then went the business school route, and then obviously entered into investment banking and worked her way up. So Sonia, you didn't study finance. Obviously, we both went to Brown, which is not exactly known for being a very finance heavy school, but you had kind of such an interesting journey. And so can you talk about what led you to ultimately want to pursue Wall Street post MBA, and then what your path was like to getting ultimately to where you are now?
Definitely. And Kristen and Jen, thanks for having me. This is so fun to come back together after, we won't say the number of years, but our 20th year reunion is coming very soon. That's exactly right. So I grew up in a small town in Washington. I'm the daughter of a couple of professors, and my mom wound up staying at home with me and my sister when we were young. I took a big departure from Pullman to CU at Brown for undergrad, where I took full advantage of the liberal education. So I took neuro and human biology and race and economics and history of modern South Asia and all of the things that one does when they've been pretty math and science heavy in high school and then have the opportunity to not be. I landed studying public health, which for me really married my interest in numbers in the form of stats and epidemiology with trying to figure out my interest in healthcare and the greater good from a true public health perspective. And then also with an economic bent, I added on a lot of economics classes in my senior year because I felt like I wanted to do something in the business world, but I hadn't quite figured that out yet. Mm-hmm. I remember learning about investment banking from friends who were getting, this was 2006, so still kind of bull market like you and others who were getting bottles of champagne from investment banks as they got offers. And just not being plugged into that system at all, because I was more focused on public health and student government and other things. After Brown, I landed at a healthcare consulting firm that was a departure from what I thought I would be doing, kind of going down more of a public service path. And the other offer that I had contemplated coming out of Brown, seriously, it was a job on the Hill in DC with my US senator. But I decided to opt for healthcare consulting, and that gave me my first window into corporate healthcare. I wasn't working in the payer provider space. I was working strictly in therapeutics with a little bit of life science diagnostics. And, I learned a few things about myself. I liked interacting with clients. I liked using my brain in combination with a team of really smart people to
Mhm.
think through hard problems. I learned the languages of PowerPoint and Excel very deeply. What I enjoyed was that kind of client interaction, problem solving, thinking through high level strategy and teamwork. What I felt like I wanted to experience that I didn't in consulting was more of a fast paced transactional element to all of the things that I was otherwise doing. And so for me, that really drove my interest in going back to get my MBA, learn about Corp Fin. Kristen and Jen, when folks like you go back for your MBA after having done the analyst gig in banking, Corp Fin classes are a joke. You know what to do.
Mhm.
It's a vacation. You already know how to DCF and LBO. I didn't know any of that. Like in consulting, the analytics were really focused more on top line build, market opportunity, revenue build. Again, the epidemiology basics and also doing primary research to supplement that. I hadn't spent a lot of
Mhm.
time on the cost side of the equation, your financial statements.
Mhm.
And so I spent my time at MIT learning how to do that and trying to get a job in finance. I summered at Goldman in 2011 and then came back full time in 2012 in the healthcare group in New York. I didn't know, just back to your original question, I didn't know if I would like it or not. I kind of made some rules for myself going into the summer, work hard, try to have fun, learn a lot, get an offer. And then at the end of
Mhm.
the summer, answer the questions. Did I like this? Do I respect the people? Could I see myself working here for a long period of time? And sure enough, I did find what I was looking for that I was missing in consulting while pairing the parts of consulting that I really liked. And most importantly, I made really amazing friendships
Mhm.
and had a lot of respect for not just the people I was working with day to day, but also teams and clients. And so I figured I'd take it a shot.
I have a quick question based off something you said. So, having not had that experience learning on the job as an analyst, but rather learning from an academic standpoint in business school, how to do the basics of the job. Can you compare and contrast the two? The analysts you see coming up now into your group under
Yeah.
you, and you see the on the job training that they got. How do you think that compares to learning in an academic environment, these things that, become so commonplace on the job? Was there more
It's
learning that you did when you then became a practitioner that was missing?
Oh, a million percent. Yes, so much. At Corp Fin in undergrad, if you go to an undergrad that has a great business school and you come in with all the skills that I learned at MIT, it's very specific. You're learning about cost of capital and what a DCF is, and you're sometimes using lumber case studies from 1972 in order to learn those concepts. But that's the kind of thing that you learn, and it's so critical to be able
Mhm.
to understand the concepts of finance in a way that can make you understand what you're doing in your job and have the fluency to kind of pursue a career. And at the same time, very little of that is actually applicable to what I do on a daily basis.
Mhm.
So, I live in we're not talking biotech yet, but I live in a world of biotech. Of course, I have some substantial clients in the kind of couple hundred billion market cap zone, in the 10 to $100 billion market cap zone. Most of my clients, though, in the sub $5 billion market cap zone, they're not profitable. They're not even revenue generating, and they might not be
Yeah.
for 5, 6 years until they can get through that sometimes 10-year clinical trial gauntlet to have an
Mhm.
Yeah.
approved drug, depending on what your
Mhm.
drug is and what you're producing. But in
Yeah.
the world I live in, you're either in the large cap zone where you're dealing with a really big company and thinking through all of the financial considerations associated with a mega cap, or you're thinking through how to finance at a very high cost of capital, likely equity only for a very long period of time
Mhm.
after a company chooses to go public, if they do, and before they have revenues. And that specific topic I didn't touch at
Mhm.
MIT.
Yeah. I find the healthcare investment banking space just so fascinating because I don't know a lot about it. I feel like it is very niche. I mean, my background, I think we were talking about this actually in the pre-call. Like I studied biomedical engineering, but then I ended up working in more of like financial sponsors, which is much more about like these boring steady state businesses that are not kind of cool and sexy. So I've again, so many things that I want to ask about. Before we get into the specifics, though, I'm actually curious. Are your clients at all concerned about any of the cuts to potential research funding to universities? Is that going to potentially harm the pipeline of new drugs? Like, do you have any view on kind of like how that potentially could impact some of these companies, or what are they doing to prepare for that?
Yeah, I think it's a moment of uncertainty. There were some big announcements this week. How do you think about what has historically been a pretty constant? I used the phrase kind of clinical trial gauntlet earlier,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
for companies that are developing therapeutics, you go through animal testing, then you go
Yeah.
through, safety testing, then you kind of go to dose finding, and then you go to ultimately your big pivotal trial that lets you get approval. And there are a lot of questions right now around, what happens. There's some proposed regulations that could make this a lot more efficient in some ways as you think
Mhm.
about the benefits of in silico testing. Of
What's
course,
that?
meaning getting drug discovery and development going enabled by tech
Got it.
rather
Okay.
than necessarily just going straight into animals. There was some chatter
Mm,
a few weeks ago coming out of the administration that they may be looking to spend more
I saw
time
that.
on um, testing outside of animals for
Mhm.
particular classes of therapeutics. And so that would be a big change for the system. I think the key question for all of us and for all of my clients is, when does this happen? How does this happen?
Yeah.
What conviction does the administration really have? Your
Hmm.
specific question was, how are these guys preparing and what are they doing? And you're just making sure that they've got the capital they need to move
Yeah.
forward, regardless of which scenario hits.
Hmm.
And making sure that they're focused on execution. Because at the end
Right.
of the day, one of the coolest things about my job and the companies that I work for, who are my clients, is that they're trying to make medicines to change
Right.
people's lives, right?
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
have an illness, no matter how kind of small or terrible, right? As you think about some of the worst cancers, these guys are innovating every single day to try to get medicines to market that can make people's quality of life better and help them live longer in a thoughtful way. And
Hmm.
regardless of what's happening out there in the ether from a geopolitical perspective, I've been so impressed that they're staying on track and doing everything that they can do to try to make that happen. So it's scenario planning.
Got it. Well, and actually, so what I'd love to talk about a little bit more is within this sort of context of just like healthcare, right? If you're working for an insurance company, it's going to be very different than if you're like helping to finance a hospital versus then there's like the biotech, which to your point is so interesting, I think, because it kind of feels very almost like venture capital ish in a way, because it's like the stakes are so high, like the risk is so much higher than like any kind of other more traditional company. And I think that the way that banks sometimes break down the segments can kind of help people who are first learning about the industry just like think about the industry itself and how to almost like wrap your arms around it. So how do you guys at Goldman segment out the different portions of quote unquote healthcare? And then specifically at like the biotech level, you were talking about almost like different market cap size. So are they then further segmented that way? Or how do you kind of look at this sort of beast that is healthcare as a whole, and how does biotech fit in?
Yeah, no, such a great question and critical, by the way, to everything that we do. And I can talk to you about my narrow vertical, which is biopharma. I'm a little bit fluent in healthcare
Mm.
outside of that. And then you asked me to tell you about the other sectors, and because I'm not living and breathing it, just couldn't give you a
You
good
can you
read in
can
that.
wave a wand over that. Just more, it's like
Exactly.
structurally big picture.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
biggest picture, obviously Goldman is a giant firm that does a lot of great things in a lot of different pockets within investment banking proper, which is part of our broader global banking and markets business. We think about our offerings as being kind of broad client service advisory in a matrixed way that's really around a set of industries that we cover, which you hinted on, kind of highest level for me. The biggest bucket I'm in is healthcare, and then we can quickly zoom down from there. But then also kind of just juxtaposed against a number of products and solutions. So as you think about our ability to help clients think through and or provide offerings for them on the capital solutions side, with debt and equity, structured finance, royalties, all of those products that we have available to our clients, matrix against the industry groups that we as kind of coverage bankers cover. So I'm a healthcare coverage banker. And then to your point, within that, healthcare has a bunch of sectors, services, which is like payers and providers, insurance companies. That can sometimes look a little bit more like real estate or FIG because of the way that those companies operate. And you think about the footprint of an oncology network or a hospital.
Yeah.
We have a vertical called life sciences and diagnostics, which is run by one of my colleagues who sits out here in San Francisco with me. And that's testing in the simplest form and tools that go into big machines in core labs that are in hospitals and outside. So that can sometimes look a little bit more like biotech and a little bit more like engineering, but you're dealing with these complex machines and science. Then you have med tech, which is a vertical, it's devices, which can range from these incredibly impressive surgical robots that you may have seen on Grey's Anatomy like 10 years ago and still like continue to
I love how you were saying Grey's Anatomy, and I was like, that's what one of the women on Southern Charm this season specialized in. Like,
totally. You can
making Greys look noble by comparison.
Clearly, it's been a while since I've watched Doctor TV as much as I love it. But then all the way down to like the screws that go in hospital beds. So that sector, I'm just trying to kind of demonstrate how diversified healthcare is, which is where you were kind of going, leading me, Kristen. But that could be like crazy complex robotics all the way through like widgets that we study in Econ 101. And maybe on the widget side, by the way, the case studies that you have in CorpFin and business school or in your undergrad business program are a little bit more relevant. Then you've got a massive tech sector within healthcare. We used to call it HCIT, digital health. That's really begun to touch everything. It has a consumer angle sometimes. It has a more tech angle sometimes. We were just talking about how drug discovery can now be very tech enabled to make what might have been a 10-year process historically into a 1-year process moving forward. And then you have biopharma. Within biopharma, you've got, you know, the mega cap companies, your top 10 biopharma companies that have drugs that are household names, heart medicine
like
for
Pfizer. Is that
exactly like Pfizer, J&J, Amgen, Bristol, Gilead, you know, all, companies that are developing a range of products that are things that you could buy in your Walgreens over the counter type medicine, all the way through the more common like statins, prescription medicines that a big portion of folks in this world are on. And so that's commercial. Those companies, though, even the most large ones, are still developing drugs, therapeutics in their pipelines. And pipeline is the word that we use to describe all of the amazing and crazy R&D stuff that's happening in these giant organizations. One of the things that's happened over the last 20 years as funding, which you also alluded to, has become more accessible for higher risk, smaller companies, is that pharma also, in addition to the kind of organic R&D that they have internally, they like to look externally to think about how they could pull in either commercial products or R&D that's kind of an external R&D arm for them that is made up of all of these amazing and nimble biotech companies that have cool ideas for one or more therapeutics that they are developing as their sole mission. The biotechs can be more nimble because they don't have to worry about things yet necessarily like EPS or recapitalization, right? They have this single source of equity financing, and their entire job is to try to bring this idea to market. And so in some ways, they can be a little bit more efficient. In other ways, they're less efficient because they might not have the full experience set. It's not a blanket rule. But as we think about our ecosystem, yes, it's very much kind of the large mega caps. Then it's the folks that have grown from nimble biotech into commercial companies that never got taken out, maybe by choice. They were never acquired. And those over time evolve into the bigger pharma companies if they don't get acquired.
What's the size that a company would need to be to like go to, say, a Goldman as their banker? You know, if you have companies that are pre-revenue, like how are you kind of assessing whether they potentially are a good fit for Goldman?
No size requirements. So I've got some clients that have done 100 million Series A rounds, meaning like 100 million valuation. And they might not need us yet, right?
Yeah.
But they could also be developing the next drug for a particular type of metabolic disease or
The next
cancer or
Ozempic.
yeah, totally. Or some sort of neurodegenerate. We haven't cracked the Alzheimer's code yet or Parkinson's,
Mhm.
like they could be doing something that is so wildly innovative and so desperately needed, not just
Mhm.
in our field, but in this world. My job is really fun because yes, I'm responsible for the larger caps and making sure that they're adequately financed and covered by Goldman and we're giving them what they need, but also just being a thought partner to the really,
Mhm.
really, really early stage guys as they move on their journey. As we think about kind of our formal public coverage set, that kind of starts in the mid hundreds of millions, but with the market where it is, a lot of our companies that have been in that zone are significantly south of that right now. And
Mhm.
that's where we don't have bright lines because we're focused on the science. You asked, how do we make those decisions? Um, this is a fun job. Biotech is a really fun job also because you have to take on a little bit more of an investment mindset. I've met thousands of tiny biotech companies going after very similar and different things. And when you
Mhm.
meet them, you start to learn like, how's this management team? How do they
Mhm.
manage their capital? Who do they rely on from an expert perspective if they don't have it in house? Because they probably can't because they're so small.
Right.
What's their idea? Do they have the resources to kind of move from idea to practical development of this drug? And we try to spend time with the companies that we get really, really excited about on all of those planes.
Excellent.
So one question, kind of leveraging all of your various interests, right? Whether it be public health or whether it be actually your initial plan to go work on the Hill. I imagine that, and I'm sure this is true to some extent for every industry, but obviously for drug development, which is so deeply entwined with going through an FDA approval process and things like that, where there is like a lobbying, navigating this political element to it. And then in the current political environment, where there is backlash at the very top levels against quote unquote big pharma in certain areas. How do you or how does an investment banker navigate that political element to an investment banking vertical? Where do you develop that expertise? Are you, hey, listen, we're going to partner you with this person who can explain how to navigate the FDA approval process for these kind of drugs because you guys are early stage and you've never been through it before? Or like, how involved do you get in that thought partnership to those levels?
Yeah, such a great question. And I love that you asked the question. This sounds like a commercial, but it's not. You think we can talk about all the reasons that I'm still in banking 12 and a half years later. And one of them is that this is an amazing firm and it has access to the most brilliant minds inside of the space, our core competencies, and then also outside. Um, we have a set of, as I mentioned, experts internally, like
Mhm.
our chief economist, our chief political economist. We've got a vice chairman of the firm who is previously CEO of the Dallas Fed. Certainly, our CEO, David Solomon, our president, John Waldron, and our head of banking and markets. These guys are constantly in direct dialogue, not only with folks that matter in the finance world, right? They're direct peers, but they're direct peers in executives of other mega cap companies across the industry. They're in direct dialogue with folks on the Hill and in the administration. And we've also got a set of folks inside of Goldman whose job is specifically to interface with government agencies in order to understand what the heck is going on out there at any moment, geopolitically, financially, from a regulatory perspective. And I have direct access to every single one of those people to spend time with my clients who might be interested in talking to them if that is of interest to my clients. So
Mhm.
I'm learning a lot from all of these people that I just mentioned. But one of the things that's awesome is if, my client has a question about something, I can grab one of those people and just bring them to my next meeting to have the direct
You're like,
dialogue
hey,
or set up a
Solomon, we
Zoom
got a question
tomorrow.
about this
Yeah.
drug that's coming up the pipeline. Like, come up on this call.
I think David would probably be the first to say that he would not be your expert for a specific drug, but many, many other things in the world. But it's really cool. It is really cool. And and it's special and I think it helps get dialogue going and give a level of access. The other thing I'll say is I'm just an investment banker. And
Mhm.
that means I'm an advisor. My job is so much less hard than the people who are operating the businesses that I am advising. But the cool thing that I do have, and we have, and my peers at Goldman have, is access to a really big sample set.
Mm.
So I cover, 50 plus publicly traded companies and a long tail of private companies behind that. And then I spend time with a lot of public companies that I don't necessarily formally cover. And so as their questions come in, and as I hop on the phone with them or sit down for a coffee or a drink and get their observations, I have this kind of building internal database that is helpful. Of course, I'm not sharing confidential information
Mhm.
amongst my client base, but we have this repository of knowledge and then all of this subjective stuff like
Well, and best
sentiment.
practices, right?
Best
Like, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, are you happy today? Are you scared? Are you staring at your stock price or have you gotten to a place where you can ignore it because? And just being able to kind of communicate those themes across the set of other clients beyond the one I just spoke to about X very scary thing is really cool. And I think that's a really important way that we can add value and help.
It's funny. It actually, hearing you talk about why you love what you do reminds me of when Jen and I talk about why we love what we do, because we basically just get to have like conversations with really smart people all the time and we get to learn nonstop. And it feels like, especially for
That's
someone
how I
like
feel about my
you,
job. Yeah,
that's what I was going to say. Like you're
100%.
literally on the cutting edge of these major breakthroughs in science and technology and healthcare. And it does. It actually like was hearing you talk about it. I'm like, I should have done that. Like that sounds so cool.
It's not too late, Kristen.
I know,
We
right?
are always looking for brilliant people to come back to finance. But that's it. It's
Um,
such a privilege. It's fun
yeah,
every single day.
yeah.
Um,
Well, and actually, to piggyback off of that, I'm actually curious because you did mention how you obviously went to MIT and you were learning about like how to run a DCF and all this stuff, but like you weren't learning that some of the necessarily like nitty gritty of the biotech valuation and all that. And so I'm actually curious, what are some things that some new analyst who's going into say like biotech, like what are some of the things that they should understand from like a valuation standpoint? Is there things that are different? Like again, you might not really be able to do some of the financial modeling in like the traditional way that you would learn if you did like a financial modeling training class because you don't have revenues yet. So what are some of the things that make, I guess, like at the more junior level, like what are some of the tangible valuation and modeling things that are different that someone who's interested in biotech should potentially just be aware of?
yep. Great question. And this will be very helpful if people are looking to do interviews at any point soon. Some of the questions I always ask. I would say two things primarily. One, and I think this would be the same across industries at Goldman as I sit through hiring interview debriefs, the
Mm-hmm.
way your brain works really matters. So we don't expect, and I'm sure you say this to the folks that you're in contact with who are recruiting for banking. Of course, like the basics that you read in the Vault prep guide or whatever the thing is today, 20 years later, since I last looked at
And
it,
the Wall Street Skinny website.
the Wall Street Skinny website, time with Kristen and Jen. Beyond that, you obviously you have to have those basics down. But
Yeah.
beyond that, we just want to hire smart people who have integrity, who seem to be intellectually curious, and who we would like to hang out with
Mm-hmm.
because you spend a lot of time, a lot of hours in banking working with people and problem solving, and you just need somebody that can really be a thought partner. Also, hopefully, that's the same criteria that our clients use when they're trying to figure out whether or not they want to work with us. But so
Right.
that's the number one most important thing. A lot of this is actually pretty intuitive. So
Mm-hmm.
so then unpacking kind of number two, what are some of the things we do in biotech? A lot of the Wall Street Skinny slash Vault Guide prep that you learn are kind of trading metrics and comparables. A lot of those things require a financial metric that biotech companies don't have yet.
Right.
And so, really, the only way that we can fundamentally really assess value of a biotech company is the DCF, the good old fashioned DCF. Except if you do a 5 year DCF, you're not going to get anything because they're still spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year in that
Mm-hmm.
5 year period. So you have to go out basically until patent expiry of the planned drug. So we're building like 20, sometimes 25-year DCFs. And the
Wow.
most important things to think about are the revenue curve and how do you get there? It's the number of things that you're selling times the price, just like any other industry. But the number of things that you're selling question is super nuanced.
Right.
How many people in the world have this disease? Can you test for this disease? If you can test for it, how many people have access to a test? Because take a drug that requires a test, you can't sell the stuff unless someone's taking the test, right? So, if you're in an interview or as we think about doing something for one of our clients for a drug that's never been made, for a disease that's never been treated, we're doing a lot of this brainstorming about how do you actually get to the top line. Once you establish that total market, then we think about what's the competitive landscape. And that's a very important and strategic question for a drug that might not be launched until 10 years from now. Then you have to kind of map the landscape of all the other stuff that's in development and could potentially launch between now and then. And again, this is why I'm still here. This is why it's fun. This is why the consulting background, I think, by the way, helps.
Yes.
And my job feels a little like consulting because we're doing, and then you get to some sort of market size, and then you have to apply a probability of success. And so we've talked about the drug development gauntlet, but if you look back across types of therapeutics, gene cell therapy, small molecules, antibodies, all of the things, and you make massive generalizations, which you should never do, about 10% of drugs that start in animal testing or move from animal testing to humans, 10% make it.
Wow.
That means 90% of them fail. And each time you go through this gauntlet of, okay, it's safe, okay, it works in this population, you increase the probability of success, reduce the risk, and that top line, or what we call the adjusted revenue over time, increases. Unadjusted revenue is just the market and the penetration.
Yeah.
And then you whack it down by the probability of success. And then after somebody passes through all the gauntlets and launches a drug, that's actually the moment where it's 100% probability of success.
Yep.
And then there's no risk adjustments required.
Sorry, just a nerdy question. Because when we typically build a DCF, your WACC is going to just stay constant. Like, are you changing the WACC as you go as well? Is the cost of capital changing?
No, the way we think about WACC is in the moment that we're doing the valuation, we have a set WACC that's applicable to the full set of revenue streams and ultimately, obviously, the discounted cash flows that we, the cash flows that we discount back to get to the NPV. In this moment, it's X. But as companies move through the risk gauntlet, in addition to the macro factors that we build into the WACC that you are more than familiar with, in addition to all of that, we do think about, okay, how has the company's peers for beta analysis, for example, if we're using comps to try to get to a beta, if we're not using a company's own beta for some reason, if they're a company that's just moved out of animal testing into humans, that's really high risk. It's a very different set of peers than a company that's about to launch. And so a company that's about to launch may have a lower cost of capital. And then when you're thinking about pharma, their cost of capital is oftentimes half of what we have for biotechs. Fun, nerdy anecdote, even in the last 6 months with everything that's happening in the world, even fundamental valuations for companies are decreasing a little bit because the WACC, as we measure it, is just objectively up because of the broader volatility.
Yeah, that makes sense. Zooming out a little bit, when kind of talking about looking at these profitability analyses and game theories about pursuing drug development, knowing how slim the odds can be, right? And you're always going for this jackpot moment where you discover the next, you said Ozempic or whatever. My college roommate works in rare disease, but in the nonprofit side. And so one of the things that I always wonder about is we look at all the other investment banking verticals and you've got retail and power and tech, or you talked about the widgets, even in the healthcare vertical, where deciding between the square screw and the round screw, it's not a life and death matter. But when you're thinking about drug development, you have on the one hand, well, listen, if we change this formula by 10% this way, it's a formula for wonky toenails that's going to be a blockbuster. But if we change it 10% in the other way, it might cure this pediatric rare disease that impacts 10 children a year. Which are we going to choose? The next Ozempic or the thing that might save lives, but it's only going to save 5 lives rather than 5 million people buying our product? How do you navigate that moral component to it as you're running these analyses and guiding these companies through pursuing various courses of action?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I like to think that we're the thought partner and really helping the companies in differentiated ways. And I take a lot of pride in that. And at the end of the day, we are just the advisor.
Mm-hmm.
And our CEOs are the ones who are fighting the fight. One of my clients might have, and this is the case, of like has devoted his entire life to trying to figure out how to tackle rare genetic diseases. And others are passionate and empowered to do other things.
Mm-hmm.
And the cool thing about my job is that I've got license and permission from the top to not be transactional. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
banker, right? I live and breathe transactions, and that's what I love and get paid for. But I have license to not be transactional, which means that if a company is in a moment where they can't transact because they can't raise money, because the opportunity is deemed too small and too
Mm-hmm.
risky for the public markets to support it right now, I get to help them think through alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
Is there some private company that
Right.
has a lot of cash and another failed drug that they could merge with to keep them going until the equity markets are back? Is there an opportunity for them to get acquired by some big company because of their lead product and spin off with the help of a few investors, again, into the private domain, some of the earlier stage, high potential, but tiny, tiny indications? And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm not trying to dodge your question, but very rarely am I
I don't
actually
think that's
put,
dodging at all. I think that that's showing
yeah,
how there's creative solutions for people who want to pursue those passion projects
yeah,
that may be meaningful but not yet profitable. That there are solutions, and that's kind of where I was hoping you'd go with this. Rather,
yeah,
that part of your job can be facilitating that. It may just not look like, well, we did a DCF and the answer wasn't the answer that you want,
yeah,
right? So I think that
yeah,
that's actually a really important piece of this that people may not understand, and who poo-poo the work of the for-profit segment of what you do, right,
yeah.
relative to the more noble nonprofit. And I think that's actually a very important service that you can provide that many people might not know about.
I appreciate it, Jen. And it's not talked about because also many times these transactions aren't public or they
Mm-hmm.
might not even be transactions. But it's so important. But I just have the most massive respect for the founders and CEOs and funders in this sector who are doing that. And
Yeah.
I do think it's really important to appreciate how mission critical it is to fund this stuff
Yeah.
because sometimes pharma doesn't have a license to develop drugs that might sell less than $500 million in a year.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? There are a ton of people out there with really, really, really terrible diseases that
Right.
I'm sure, as your friend is dealing with every day, need drugs for conditions that if you sold even at crazy high prices in aggregate would be far, far less than that.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. I think that's such an interesting thing about the sector in general, right? It's like you talked about Alzheimer's, you talked about Parkinson's, but there are God knows how many diseases every day where it's like, okay, we're one of 1,000 families in the country dealing with this, and we need to band together. And so knowing that if there is someone who has taken that cause as far as it can go, that there are additional options being offered effectively by the best in class in the for-profit sector. I think that's still really helpful to be aware of and to understand.
One question I have, because biotech seems like it seems to share so many similarities with tech, and yet I feel like the types of people who go into each are probably actually so different, like the CEOs of these companies. And so, correct me if I'm wrong. Is it mostly the case that a lot of the people that are CEOs of this like biotech company oftentimes are the researcher who's doing some of the work? Because, you think of like the tech guy, it's like the Mark Zuckerberg in his dorm room. I mean, he was our year, he was like an '06 and then dropped out. But like these like kids who, whatever, like they know how to code. It seems like you need to actually be doing the research. You need to like have the drugs, therapeutics. Like there's so much more that it seems like you need to know. And it's like, just, I don't want to say be a PhD, but what is sort of the archetype of the CEOs who are in this space? What's the,
Totally diversified. Another
yeah,
great question. Totally diversified. You certainly have the phenotype that you mentioned, which is kind of the researcher founder has devoted the last sometimes 30 or 40 years of their lives to developing something in the lab that's an idea, crosses the tech transfer threshold into corporate world with the help of some investors, and then that person stays in the CEO seat. Um, Sometimes that person becomes CEO of that company when it goes public a couple years later and stays into the seat until eternity. Sometimes at the point of going public, that more kind of founder scientist CEO phenotype might transition by the way, by their choice.
Yeah.
Like this is someone that's devoted their life to building something unbelievable with biology, and they might not want to be a public company CFO that's responsible for quarterly earnings calls and like dealing with HR and all the things that comes with the operator's world. Sometimes if there is a transition or if an idea is born in the lab and that founder doesn't want to be leader from day one, oftentimes an entrepreneur in residence at a VC or one of the early funders of the company will step into the CEO role. And then as companies drive into kind of the more mature zone, moving through clinical development, just like in every other industry, there's a lot of switching and kind of lateral hires amongst companies. So someone who was previously at a CBO or a CFO at a larger company might transition to a CEO role. And then once a company's commercial, it's very nuanced, but commercial is commercial. And sometimes we get kind of folks outside of the biotech industry moving into the CEO seat. So it's cool, again, back to this point that there is not one size fits all. When you're sitting in this seat, you're navigating different types of people with different interests and different personalities and different goals and different passions. The kind of the one shared characteristic or phenotype is that everyone is trying to work through some massive unmet need to try to help a group of people that don't currently have a solution.
Well, and so aside from the type of people that you are dealing with in your client base, one of the questions we get asked time and time again is for the young people coming up through a group like yours. What are you seeing as the typical exit opportunities? I mean, it's tremendous that you made it all the way to partner. There are so many people who are saying, though, well, I want this to be a stepping stone to my next thing. And we have so many young listeners who are trying to gamify their career and say, well, I want to be in the best group that's going to get me the best exit opportunity so I have the best job 10 years hence, et cetera, et cetera. What do we see as the typical path for someone coming up through healthcare, specifically through biotech? And where do you see the preponderance of opportunities for those people?
Yeah, of course. I think most traditional, if you're not staying at the firm, is to go to the buy side. So same in healthcare as everywhere else. I think the nuance in healthcare and in biotech is that because of the way we stretch your brain, you have an opportunity to maybe go to a VC or kind of an earlier stage, not your traditional big PE firm, or maybe the growth arm or the biotech or life sciences arm of that PE firm. Or one of the smaller, scrappier biotech specialists, which is really fun and cool. We see folks going to hedge funds, of course, because again, they've got the technical skill set to be able to do that. And then outside of that, I mean, people go anywhere. Like when I think about the people I want to hire, we talked about it earlier. I want to hire smart people that are excited to do something. They might not know anything about healthcare yet, but that want to go and change the world in some way. And maybe you do that by becoming an investor and a founder someday. But, maybe you go to the Gates Foundation or, maybe you start your own company. We've had people go to space startups and we've had people go, I had an analyst go to Goop. Like across the board, I think the boot camp, and obviously I think Goldman is special and I love it, but I think if you're going to a high quality investment bank, you're bulletproof coming out of here. You can communicate with anybody, you can get anything done. You're thoughtful, you're kind, you're a good communicator. And that means that with this behind you, if this is not your choice for a lifetime, which I want it to be because I hired you because I love you, like you can do anything.
What percentage of analysts are staying on beyond 2 years these days?
Oh, man, I don't know. I wish I had those stats.
I'm just curious if it's close to zero, which is kind of my conventional perception of it, or if you're seeing an increase in more lifers.
I mean, even think of a couple of MDs, but some of the most effective people that move through started as an analyst or started as an associate. And I think that might be Goldman specific.
I was going to say.
But once you absorb kind of the Goldman we and team-based everything, and even some of the examples we talked about in rare disease where you're forced to be entrepreneurial here, like it keeps people. I don't know what the
that makes
stats are
sense.
though.
One other quick question on what you do from an advisory role. And then I wanted to talk about like banking in San Francisco more broadly. But at Morgan Stanley, the way that they structured their groups is like there was the different industry groups and there was an external M&A group. Do you guys do your own M&A? Like, are you advising on like your own M&A because it's such a specific niche thing within your group? Yeah. Okay. That was
And in every group. So
interesting.
that's
So
one
there's
of the
no M&A
big,
group at Goldman?
no, we do have kind of a global M&A leadership. And in healthcare, we have a head of healthcare M&A. Up until you make managing director, there's no distinction. And so
Interesting.
that's one of the biggest selling points. One of the reasons I came to Goldman, and that's one of the biggest selling points, is that you do up through your last day as VP, you do the M&A. So you're responsible to do the math. There's no handoff. You do the IPOs, you do the financings, you do the debt, you do the
You do
M&A.
everything.
And then when you get promoted to MD, you are either promoted into a coverage role, which I am, I'm a biotech coverage banker, or you're promoted into an execution role. And that means you're an M&A person. But I have a kind of an M&A partner on all of my accounts. They have more clients than I do, but they spend time with me, even honestly, sometimes in a non-transactional way. But then for the transaction, they're the one that's being a check and bringing the execution specific capabilities. Doing defensive work for our clients is a really big part of what we do, because you can imagine that, if somebody is going to be trading, a biotech company is going to be trading in the public market today at a level that's very different than what we and the company think their actual fundamental value is, which is much, much higher. I mean, sometimes we work for companies for 20 years before they get sold.
And actually, one other question. I am so much more familiar with the types of roles where a company comes to you because they want to go public, right? Or they want to issue debt to the public, or maybe they're going to do a convert. But it sounds like you're saying, some of your clients, they don't have revenues yet. So do you guys do almost like series funding to help them find like venture? Like, are you doing some of the earlier stage investing, like helping facilitate that as well, or not really? Like it's more.
We do. We have a private business, and actually even in healthcare, outside of healthcare and more broadly, there's more and more and more focus on private financing, a huge focus of the firm right now. Just a client's not going to get the best bang for their buck from us if they want us to help with a series A, B, C. But if we, to the example, or it's a fair question because we were talking about being a thought partner, always happy to kind of give over the shoulder advice. Typically, the first time we would formally have a role with them is at their IPO. And then these companies are raising equity, even if they have years to revenue or profitability, they hit one of those kind of clinical inflection points that de-risks them, their probability of success goes up, their stock price goes up. And so that's kind of the typical moment where these companies would finance, and we're doing a equity follow-on for them at that moment.
Well, actually, that brings me to another question. In the news, people are talking about so many companies not going public for so much longer. Do a lot of these companies go public earlier because they need the financing versus like the outside of the space?
So historically, and there are some cool charts that I don't have with me now, but during COVID, there was a biotech bubble, 2020, 2021, there were 75 almost biotech IPOs, over 50 million in both of those years. And then it, completely dropped off of that after the biotech crash in February 2021. But yes, in those 2 years, there were a lot of kind of even preclinical and phase 1 companies going public. Historically, it's been kind of phase 2, but still well in advance of revenue.
Why was there a biotech crash in February of 2021? It seems like a really good time for biotech to take off when they just came out with like the vaccine to end the pandemic.
Such a great question. So the XBI, which is our biotech index, is inversely correlated with rates.
And there we go. Why?
Yeah. Because of volatility and risk.
But isn't like Johnson & Johnson like the top rated, like isn't it rated higher than the US government?
Yes, but that's where also the bifurcation, and one of the questions that you guys asked earlier around what's the segmentation within the biopharma set, the mega cap biopharma companies have always been viewed as a safe place for investors to go, except for right now, which is just a weird moment in history. They
Mm-hmm.
have commercialized products. It's almost like a
Yep.
totally different company
Mm-hmm.
versus pre-commercial biotech is so
Yeah.
risky. It's a totally different
And
bucket.
that's what comprises the index, you're saying.
Yes, yes,
So
it's the
because, okay,
earlier
got it.
stage,
So
the
that makes
earlier
sense
stage
that
stuff.
those guys would be inversely related to
And
intersects.
that's
That
actually been
yeah.
a conversation I've heard people talking about recently, given everything that is happening right now, is that like the new defensive stocks are your Apples and your Amazon, or maybe not Amazon, because again, the tariffs aren't going to exactly be great to them, but like
But
it
everyone with
is your
cash.
Magnificent Seven type stocks that historically you would think of as tech as like high growth and it's high risk. And now it's like, that's your defensive play. So
Yeah.
that all kind of makes sense. I mean,
And so whoever
there's so
doesn't
many
need to borrow money.
yeah, but there's so many parallels with sort of, again, tech and like biotech in so many ways.
In our sector, chatter about the rate cuts over the course of this year, the more rate cuts, obviously, the better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For us
Which
to
the
be able to.
Fed literally just made their announcement at 2 p.m. Doesn't seem like those are happening sooner. A lot of talk about inflation.
All right. So quickly, because I know we're running short up on time. So you obviously work in San Francisco. You did your MBA at MIT, which is in Cambridge. That's on the East Coast. What made you decide to go to San Francisco? I know the tech sector is traditionally in San Francisco. Is that like most banks, biotech tends to be over there as well? And then also B, can you talk about the lifestyle in San Francisco? Because I always was told that it was actually counterintuitively worse than in New York, because it's like you had to be in super early, because if you had like a 10 a.m. morning meeting on the East Coast, you'd have to be in at 7, which is very early for a banker, but then you're still kind of working the later hours. So I'd love to understand like A, why you moved there, B, again, why biotech is there. And then finally, what the lifestyle is like relative to other parts of the country.
Yes. So why I moved, half personal, half professional.
Hmm.
So on the professional side, and answering one of your second question or one of your other questions, um, biotech in the United States is really concentrated in San Francisco Bay Area, San Diego, a little bit down into kind of LA, Southern California, and then Boston. There's a
Yeah,
little
I
bit
was
more
thinking
up and coming
Boston.
in
I
New
was actually
York,
surprised it wasn't more Boston.
and then Research Triangle. But historically, Jen, to your point, San Francisco Bay Area and Boston are considered the two biggest hubs.
Got it.
So there's just so much. There's just so much to do out here. And when we think about historically the larger biotech and pharma companies we've had on the West Coast, Genentech, which obviously Roche acquired. We sold Genentech to Roche years ago, Amgen down in LA, Thousand Oaks, and then Gilead.
Okay.
And so those three companies in and of themselves are really, really important to the ecosystem. And then as you think about departures over those companies through the cycles and around various M&A events, there is this unbelievable alumni base from those three companies out here that's just this flywheel of company generation. So then VCs have been born out here, and there's just a lot to do all the time. So
Yeah.
it felt like a fun, white space for me to kind of join forces with the guy who was previously my boss and has now moved on to do other cool things inside of Goldman. And then personally, I had just gotten married in July of 2014. Let me get my years right on that. And I wanted to start a family. And my partner, his whole family is in the UK, and doing a lot of babies while we both had crazy jobs in Manhattan felt very scary. And
Yeah, I can attest. I
which
do
I
not recommend. 0 out of
yes,
10.
yes.
But
0 out of
San
10.
Francisco is not much. I mean, having a lot of babies in San Francisco is not much easier than having a lot of babies in New York City.
It's my parents are close. So we thought
Ah,
about, could we move to the UK to be closer to his family? Could we move to the West Coast? My parents are outside of, they're down on the peninsula. My sister's here as well. And so there was
mhm.
like the gravitational
Yes.
Gupta pull. And then quality of life was another question. When I moved out here, I was an associate up for VP 10 years ago. March 31st, 2015 is when I moved to San Francisco. And so we try to do a lot of regional staffing, and there's certainly enough substrate out here to do it. So from a time zone perspective, that helps a little bit. But yeah, sometimes it can be tricky. Luckily, I think in banking, we're less driven by market hours than
Right.
some other parts of the finance ecosystem. and we have access to ocean and mountains and trails, and that's really fun. You know, we live in the city. We just bought our second home in the city a year ago, moved out of our old one, like single family home with a lawn, just got a cat, like, you know, doing a very suburban life in a city in a way that I don't think I could have done in Manhattan.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
fair. And I mean, what is the travel like? Because you have three little kids. I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know, from your perspective, like to me, that's always what has been the hardest part is, I mean, the hours are one thing, but it's like the travel. Are you traveling a lot? And again, like how are you able to balance that with like a family?
Yeah. So yeah, short answer, yes. We, you know, ran straight out of COVID and back into travel. The good news is that, again, most of my clients are either here or in San Diego, LA,
Okay.
Seattle, West Coast. And so that can be a day trip.
Got it.
And so in that case, I'm probably gone either for breakfast or for dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Chris drives the kids to school anyway because the school is on his way to work.
Nice.
And but it's a partnership, and as you guys both know, all families look very different, but in any kind of two working parent family, whether that work is inside the home or out of the home, it's a lot. And
Mm-hmm.
and we just figure it out as a team. You know, today's Wednesday, I was in New York on Monday. I left San Francisco Sunday night, got into New York overnight, flew back Monday night, and I was home overnight so I could be with my kids on Tuesday morning. Next week, Monday, I've got a dinner in San Francisco. On Monday night, I fly to New York overnight for a morning meeting on Tuesday, and then I
Oof.
fly back that day. So it is
Okay.
kind of crazy, but like we make our bed. And I
Yeah.
have one of the coolest jobs in the world, and I love my
Yeah.
clients and I love what I do.
Yeah.
And I try to, you know, make the travel low impact on my family. And I'm, again, so grateful to have a partner who also has a very intense job and also has to travel sometimes, but is willing to navigate it as a team with me.
I mean, I will say, I mean, we have had so many just ridiculous men and women on our podcast who have families with young kids. And the thing that is clear is you have to love what you do. And so it's like when you love what you do, it's like you're going to make it work. And having a supportive partner is obviously huge. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's,
That's the most, from my perspective, I feel grateful that my parents gave me lift off and my sister supports and my partner supports. And I know that's luck.
yep. Well, is there any other advice that you would give to anyone who is interested in going to business school, breaking into banking post business school, or I don't know, anything, any parting thoughts that you want to share with our
Yeah.
listeners?
I would say if you think banking sounds interesting, give it a shot. There are very few jobs in the world where on a daily basis, you know, Kristen, the point that you made earlier, you get to advise and learn from like the most exceptional leaders in the world in an industry that you're really excited about and that you care about.
Yeah.
And the early years, yeah, can be a little bit brutal as you're banking so hard and DCFing so hard at that computer for however many hours a day and night. But remember that you're building a really cool skill set that is a privilege to have that you'll be able to use at this job or others. And before you know it, you know, you're in a seat that you didn't even necessarily plan to be in. And it's a
Yeah.
lot of fun. So I would just encourage people to give it a shot because it's a great place to be. And I've had a lot of fun over the last decade plus.
Well, I will say you got me like to be like, that really does sound fun. So there's been maybe one or two other conversations where I was like, wow, like listening to you talk about having these conversations with people who are on the literal cutting edge of these new developments, like that is so cool. And like the cutting edge of technology, like that is so cool. I feel like everyone thinks, oh, I want to go into tech. I'm like, dude, biotech. Anyway, that's
Yes.
all.
Yes. Preach that. Preach that. But thanks for having me. I love what you guys are doing.
This was amazing. Thank you so much,
So
Sonia.
Yeah.
You were
cool.
absolutely brilliant.
Look forward to catching up soon.